At 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night in August 2026, with less than 2 hours on the clock, the President of the United States blinked first. 50% tariffs on $20 billion of Canadian goods were set to hit at midnight. Dairy, alcohol, furniture, electronics, the kind of blanket economic strike usually reserved for adversaries, not for America's second largest trading partner. And then, with the deadline bearing down, Donald Trump pulled back. Not canceled. Paused. 3 days until the end of the day on Friday, August the 21st. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney's office released a short, careful statement. Substantial progress has been made, Carney said, although there is important work still to be done. No victory lap, no triumphant press conference, just a former central banker, choosing his words the way he used to choose his words when a wrong sentence could move a currency market. That single sentence tells you almost everything about how this fight has actually been fought. Not with slogans, not with fireworks, with patience, with silence when silence served him better than noise, and with a refusal to hand Donald Trump the one thing Trump has wanted from this negotiation since the very beginning, a Canadian leader who loses his composure on camera. This is the story of how a trade war that Washington expected to win in a matter of weeks turned into a grinding 18-month standoff, and how the man running Ottawa's side of it built his entire strategy around not giving the President of the United States a single dramatic moment to work with. To understand what happened this week in Washington, you have to go back to the spring of 2025, to the moment this all really started. Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister then, deeply unpopular, and Donald Trump had already begun needling him in public, calling him governor, floating the idea that Canada would simply be better off as the 51st American state. Most observers in Ottawa treated it at first as trolling, a rhetorical jab aimed at a weakened leader on his way out the door. Trudeau resigned in March of 2025. The Liberal Party, which looked headed for a historic defeat only months earlier, suddenly had a new leader in Mark Carney, a man who had never held elected office in his life, but who had run the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England, and who understood, better than almost anyone in Canadian politics, exactly how markets and governments actually negotiate with each other. Carney's campaign slogan became two words that would define the next year and a half of Canadian politics. Elbows up. It's a hockey phrase, the posture a player takes when he's bracing for a check along the boards, and Canadians embraced it instantly. Liberal support surged. Trump's talk of annexation, instead of intimidating Canadian voters, appears to have done the opposite. It fused a divided electorate around the idea that their sovereignty was actually on the table, and that they needed a leader willing to say so bluntly. Carney won the election on a platform of confronting Trump's threats directly, and did exactly that from his very first meeting with the American president. That first Oval Office meeting in the spring of 2025 set the tone for everything that followed. Trump praised Carney as a very talented person. Carney, for his part, called Trump a transformational president. Flattery, deployed strategically, the way a negotiator opens with common ground before drawing a hard line. And draw the line he did. When Trump, sitting right beside him, brought up his real estate background and mused again about erasing the border between the two countries, Carney didn't flinch and didn't posture. There are some places that are not for sale, he told the president, and added that Canada, having just been chosen by its own people in an election fought over exactly this question, was one of those places. It won't be for sale ever, Carney said, but the opportunity is in the partnership. That phrase, the difference between a wish and a reality, became something close to a doctrine for Carney over the following months. Trump kept talking about the 51st state. He told NBC's Kristen Welker later that year that he would always talk about it, repeating a claim that the United States subsidizes Canada to the tune of $200 billion a year, a figure that does not hold up against actual U.S. trade data, but one Trump has repeated regardless. When a reporter asked whether he'd consider military force to annex Canada, Trump said he didn't think it would ever come to that, though he added, almost as an aside, that something could happen with Greenland. A comment that briefly pulled Denmark into the same anxious conversation. Carney's response to all of this, over and over, in public and reportedly in private as well, was the same formula. The president has made known his wish about that issue for some time. I've been careful always to distinguish between wish and reality. Underneath the rhetoric about statehood, the real fight was always about tariffs, and it escalated in stages that are worth walking through carefully, because each one raised the stakes further. Trump's justification, consistently, was fentanyl, the claim that Canada wasn't doing enough to stop the synthetic opioid from crossing into the United States. Multiple outlets, including The Hill, pointed out that the actual volume of fentanyl crossing the northern border is a small fraction of what crosses from Mexico. But the justification stuck around anyway, appearing again and again in Trump's public letters and executive orders as the stated rationale for new duties. In July of 2025, Trump posted a letter to Carney on his social media platform, informing him that starting August the 1st, the United States would impose a 35% tariff on Canadian products not already covered by the existing trade agreement between the two countries known as CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the successor to NAFTA that had governed trade between the three nations since 2020. If Canada raised its own tariffs in response, Trump wrote, whatever number Canada chose would simply be added on top of the 35%. It was, in effect, an invitation to retaliate, paired with a warning about what retaliation would cost. Canada had already, months earlier, imposed its own counter-tariffs on American goods, and provinces across the country had pulled American alcohol off liquor store shelves, a symbolic but economically real gesture that the Trump administration later cited, almost with irritation, as proof that Canada had picked a fight it needed to be held accountable for. Trump followed through. On August the 1st, the 35% tariff took effect, formalized in an executive order signed just ahead of the deadline. Carney's government, according to Canadian outlets covering the signing, expressed open disappointment that Trump had gone ahead with it, despite the ongoing talks. But Carney didn't respond with an escalation of his own rhetoric. Instead, later that same August, his government quietly removed a number of Canada's retaliatory tariffs on American goods that complied with CUSMA rules, a move that read, to many analysts, as an attempt to keep the door to negotiation open rather than slam it shut. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout the year. Trump would strike, Carney would absorb the strike publicly, criticize it in measured language, and then look for the narrowest possible path back toward the table. Meanwhile, Carney was building leverage somewhere else entirely, away from Washington. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, he made a string of trips to Europe, to France, and the United Kingdom, explicitly framing them as an effort to diversify Canada's economic relationships and reduce the country's dependence on a single, increasingly unpredictable trading partner. On one of those early trips to London, Carney told reporters bluntly that Trump's statehood threats needed to stop before his government could sit down for serious talks on a renewed trade partnership. It was some of the sharpest language he used publicly in the entire dispute, delivered not in Washington, but from across the Atlantic, where he was actively courting alternative partners. The message to Trump was implicit but unmistakable. Canada has other options, and it intends to use them. It's worth pausing here on who Mark Carney actually is, because it explains a lot about the style of this fight. Before he ever ran for office, Carney spent years as governor of the Bank of Canada, and after that, an unusual step for a Canadian, he became governor of the Bank of England, making him the first person in that institution's history to run a G7 central bank outside his own country. That's a background built entirely around a specific discipline. Never say more in public than the situation requires, because markets punish loose talk instantly and permanently. Central bankers learn to speak in terms like substantial progress and important work still to be done, not because they lack conviction, but because vague, calm language is a deliberate tool. It signals direction without giving anyone, including an opposing negotiator, ammunition to react against. Watching Carney's public statements throughout this trade dispute, that training is unmistakable. He rarely raises his voice in print. He almost never commits to a specific number before a deal is final. And he treats leaks and premature announcements as risks to be managed rather than moments to celebrate. Compare that with how the auto sector and the steel industry experienced this same period, because the abstraction of tariff percentages becomes very concrete very quickly once you look at specific Canadian employers. Algoma Steel, one of Canada's largest steelmakers, announced plans late last year to lay off around 1,000 workers, a decision Industry Minister Melanie Joly publicly vowed to fight, telling reporters her government would keep pushing for those jobs. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province is home to a large share of Canada's automotive manufacturing base, backed Carney's approach in the talks with Trump, calling it full support in the middle of some of the toughest stretches of the negotiation. That kind of provincial-federal alignment mattered because previous Canadian prime ministers have sometimes struggled to keep premiers rowing in the same direction during high-stakes American trade fights. Carney, by most accounts from Canadian outlets covering the file, managed to keep that coalition largely intact, even as individual sectors absorbed real, specific economic pain. The steel and aluminum tariffs deserve their own mention here, because they've quietly become one of the most persistent irritants in the entire relationship, even as attention swung toward the bigger Section 338 fight. Those duties operate under yet another piece of U.S. trade law, Section 232, justified on national security grounds rather than the fentanyl argument used elsewhere. Canada has faced 25% tariffs on a wide range of steel derivative products, with tariff rate quota levels set at only 20% of 2024 volumes for countries without a free trade agreement with Washington, and 75% of 2024 levels even for CUSMA partners like Canada that do have one. For an industry as trade exposed as Canadian steel, Numbers like that translate directly into idled shifts and canceled orders, which is part of why Joly and Ford's public commitments carried real weight with workers watching the headlines. Meanwhile, the broader Canadian economy was already absorbing the strain in ways that showed up well beyond any single factory floor. Deloitte's economic forecasters projected Canadian growth would slow to just 1.5% in 2026, a marked deceleration tied directly to trade uncertainty with the country's largest trading partner. Hiring managers surveyed heading into this year described themselves as cautious about the job market, language that, in plain terms, meant companies were holding off on new positions until they had more clarity about which tariffs were temporary and which were becoming permanent fixtures of doing business with the United States. Analysts covering the Canadian consumer also began describing what they called a K-shaped economy taking hold, one where higher income, trade-insulated households kept spending relatively normally through the holidays, while households more directly exposed to tariff-hit manufacturing and export sectors pulled back sharply, a split that shows up clearly in retail and holiday spending data from the period. By the start of 2026, the trade relationship had entered a strange, sustained equilibrium. Not resolved, not fully collapsed, just grinding forward under a patchwork of tariffs, exemptions, and legal gray areas. CUSMA-compliant goods remain largely exempt from the worst of the new duties, which meant that roughly 90% of Canadian exports to the United States kept flowing without the steepest tariffs attached, according to analysis published by RBC Economics. But sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, automotive parts, and lumber remained firmly in place under a different legal authority, Section 232, hitting some of Canada's most important export industries directly. Small and mid-sized Canadian businesses, according to reporting from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, spent months navigating a bewildering set of overlapping rules, determining which of their products qualified as CUSMA compliant, which didn't, and which tariff regime applied to which shipment on which day. Some companies that had wrongly paid tariffs under earlier, later invalidated legal authority were told they could apply for refunds. A bureaucratic footnote that captured just how chaotic the underlying legal landscape around these tariffs had become. Then came the deadline that actually mattered most, buried in the fine print of the original 2020 agreement. CUSMA had always included a mandatory joint review, scheduled for the 6th anniversary of the deal's entry into force, July the 1st, 2026. It wasn't technically an expiration date. The agreement itself doesn't lapse until 2036. But the review was supposed to be the moment when the United States, Canada, and Mexico decided together whether to extend the deal for another 16 years with only limited changes, or to reopen it for a full renegotiation, or, in the most severe scenario, for one of the parties to withdraw from it altogether with 6 months' notice. According to the Bank of Canada's own economic modeling published earlier this year, an unfavorable outcome to that review posed one of the single biggest risks to Canada's economic outlook, the kind of risk that shows up directly in projections for exports, investment, and hiring. Carney didn't wait passively for that review deadline to arrive. In April of 2026, months ahead of the July checkpoint, he formally introduced a new advisory committee on Canada-US economic relations, assembling business leaders, trade specialists, and former officials to sharpen Ottawa's strategic approach heading into the review. It was a small, largely procedural announcement compared to the tariff drama that dominated headlines, but it signaled something important about how Carney's government was actually operating behind the scenes, building institutional infrastructure for a negotiation it expected to be long and technical, rather than treating the dispute as a series of one-off crises to be managed individually as they landed. Mexico's position in all of this is easy to overlook from a Canadian or American vantage point, but it matters, because CUSMA is a trilateral agreement, not a bilateral one. Whatever emerges from the review process has to work for Mexico City as well as for Ottawa and Washington, and Mexico has faced its own separate set of tariff pressures from the Trump administration over the same period. Analysts at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute have noted that the most likely outcome of the broader review isn't a clean extension or a full collapse, but something messier in between. A revised version of the agreement with updated provisions, possibly stricter rules of origin requiring more regional sourcing, alongside the removal of at least some of Trump's harsher sectoral tariffs as part of the final trade. Nothing about that outcome is guaranteed, and the Institute's own analysts described reaching it as unlikely, though still within the realm of possibility, given how far both sides have already traveled just to get last week's pause. July, the 1st came and went. The United States did not agree to extend CUSMA for a new 16-year term. That single fact, confirmed by trade law analysts at the firm Blake's and echoed in CBC's coverage of the talks, effectively reopened the entire architecture of North American trade to negotiation at precisely the moment tensions between Ottawa and Washington were already running hot over the tariff disputes. It meant Carney's negotiators weren't just fighting over the size of a tariff on furniture or dairy. They were fighting, simultaneously, over the long-term legal framework that determines how nearly all Canadian trade with the United States operates. Then, in the days immediately surrounding that review deadline, came the sharpest escalation of the entire 18-month standoff. The White House announced it would impose new tariffs under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, an obscure, rarely used piece of American trade law that, according to CNN's reporting, had never before actually been used to impose tariffs in the way the Trump administration was now attempting. Legal challenges were expected almost immediately, precisely because the statute sat so far outside its normal historical use. The new tariffs would hit 50%, and they would apply across 3 separate categories of Canadian goods. One list covered dairy products: milk, cream, whey, and related ingredients. Trump's own proclamation cited what he called discriminatory treatment of American dairy and cheese exports compared to how Canada treats European producers. Another list, oddly labeled motor vehicles despite containing no actual cars, covered an enormous range of goods instead: electronics and telecom equipment, furniture, building materials like lumber, plywood, doors and cement, plastics, clothing, footwear, toys, and even flowers and plants. A White House official, briefing reporters on condition of anonymity ahead of the announcement, argued that Canada was one of the only countries, alongside China, to have retaliated against earlier American tariffs, and said Ottawa needed to be held accountable for that decision. The deadline was set for midnight, August the 19th. In the days leading up to it, the two sides pushed talks into their most intense phase yet. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, along with Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, spent the weekend before the deadline in Washington after a full week of prior meetings. On Sunday, LeBlanc met directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. When reporters shouted questions at Greer as he left that meeting, he offered only a curt no comment, though when a French-language reporter asked for a few words, he replied with a polite bonne journée, a small, almost theatrical moment of civility inside an otherwise tense standoff. LeBlanc, emerging shortly after, told reporters simply that the two sides would continue working, and that the job wasn't done yet. On the Monday, Carney himself spoke with Trump directly by phone. His office wouldn't detail the substance of that call publicly, only confirming that the two leaders discussed what Carney later described in his own words as very intense and delicate negotiations. And then came Tuesday night, and the pause. Less than 2 hours before the 50% tariffs were set to take effect, Trump signed off on a 3-day postponement. According to CNBC's reporting, Trump characterized the two sides as having reached a deal, even though the language coming out of Ottawa was noticeably more cautious. Carney's own statement stuck to substantial progress, careful phrasing from a man who has spent 18 months choosing his words with the precision of someone who once had to move currency markets with a single sentence at a central bank podium. The new deadline was set for the end of the day on Friday, August the 21st, giving negotiators just 3 additional days to turn a verbal framework into something that could actually survive being written down. By Wednesday, August the 19th, that framework appeared to take real shape. LeBlanc and Greer jointly announced that a deal had been struck to break the deadlock over the future of CUSMA. Carney posted his own response almost immediately, congratulating both LeBlanc and Greer for what he called significant progress made in the negotiations between the two countries. But as trade analysts covering the announcement for Policy magazine were quick to point out, that specific choice of words, significant progress, not signed agreement, was itself a signal. The deal, whatever its final shape turns out to be, had not yet been finalized. The devil, as it always is in trade law, remained in details that had not yet been made public. Negotiators were racing against the Friday deadline simply to finish the documentation on an agreement that had already, in principle, been reached. There's also a piece of this story that unfolded almost entirely outside the trade file itself, but that shaped how Carney was perceived at home while all of this was happening. In January of this year, when American forces captured Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, Carney publicly welcomed the news, calling the removal welcome news in comments to Canadian media. A rare moment of open alignment with Washington on a foreign policy matter delivered in the middle of an otherwise tense economic standoff with the same administration. It's a small data point, but it underscores something worth remembering about this entire saga. Carney's approach was never blanket opposition to Trump personally or to the United States generally. It was narrow, specific pushback on the trade and sovereignty questions, paired with cooperation everywhere else it made sense. That distinction likely made it easier for Carney to keep securing phone calls and meetings with Trump throughout the year, rather than being frozen out the way a more uniformly adversarial posture might have produced. Canadian public opinion tracked this entire arc closely, and it's part of why Carney had the room to negotiate the way he did. The wave of patriotic sentiment that followed Trump's earliest annexation talk, Canadians embracing slogans like "Buy Canadian alongside elbows up," didn't fully fade, even as Carney's own public rhetoric softened. Provincial boycotts of American alcohol, which several outlets noted had spread to nearly every province and territory except two, remained largely in place for much of the following year, a grassroots pressure campaign running in parallel with, and somewhat independent of, whatever Carney's negotiators were doing in Washington conference rooms. That combination, an angry, mobilized public providing leverage from below, and a famously unflappable technocrat providing discipline at the table, is arguably the real explanation for why Ottawa held its position as long as it did against sustained American pressure. What does all of this actually add up to, strategically? For 18 months, the pattern from Washington has been remarkably consistent. Announce an aggressive new tariff, tie it to a dramatic deadline, and wait for Ottawa to either cave publicly or lash out in a way that could be spun as Canadian overreaction. And for 18 months, the pattern from Carney's side has been just as consistent, though far less loud. Absorb the tariff. State disagreement in calm, careful language. Quietly work every available channel. LeBlanc and Charette in Washington, Carney's own phone calls with Trump, and simultaneously, a slower-burning campaign in Europe to make clear that Canada has other markets it can lean on if this one keeps closing. According to political scientist Daniel Bayland of McGill University, speaking to Yahoo News Canada earlier this year, that shift away from confrontational elbows-up rhetoric toward a quieter, more careful posture wasn't a change in who Carney fundamentally is. It reflected a calculation that, with CUSMA's future genuinely hanging in the balance, provoking Trump further was no longer politically useful. The goal, Bayland said, had shifted toward protecting what was actually happening behind closed doors in the negotiations, rather than winning news cycles in public. It's also worth remembering just how unusual the legal vehicle for this week's near miss actually was. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 is not a tool any modern American administration had reached for before in this way. It predates the entire post-war framework of trade agreements, predates the World Trade Organization, and predates CUSMA itself by nearly a century. Legal scholars quoted around the announcement expected the administration's use of it to draw immediate court challenges, precisely because invoking a Depression-era statute to justify a 50% tariff on a close ally's dairy and furniture exports sits so far outside its original narrow purpose. That legal fragility may itself have been part of what pushed Washington toward a pause, rather than actually letting the tariffs take effect at midnight. An untested legal theory, applied for the first time ever in a live trade dispute, is exactly the kind of thing that invites an immediate injunction. And a White House genuinely confident in its footing rarely needs 3 extra days to finish paperwork it already considers final. That's the real turn in this story, and it's a subtler one than the headline suggests. Nobody in Ottawa is claiming outright victory this week. The tariffs aren't gone. Some of the toughest sector-specific duties on steel, aluminum, and lumber remain in place under entirely separate legal authority, and were not part of this week's pause at all. The broader CUSMA relationship is still technically unresolved, under review annually rather than locked in for another 16 years, which trade economists at institutions like RBC and the Bank of Canada continue to flag as a lingering source of uncertainty for Canadian exporters, investors, and anyone trying to plan a supply chain more than a year or two out. What has changed is something harder to put a number on. Donald Trump came into this fight by nearly every outside account, expecting a fast, lopsided win against a smaller, dependent neighbor. Instead, he is still negotiating, 18 months later, with a Canadian government that never gave him the public collapse he seemed to be angling for. And that spent the same 18 months quietly building relationships in Europe that reduce, even if only modestly so far, exactly how dependent Canada actually is on the American market in the first place. Before we go any further, it's worth being straightforward about what remains genuinely uncertain here, because a story like this deserves honesty about its own limits. The exact terms of the deal that LeBlanc and Greer say they've reached have not been publicly released in full, and Policy Magazine's own analysis specifically cautioned that the wording used by both governments leaves real room for the details to still fall apart before Friday's deadline. Trump's claim that the U.S. subsidizes Canada by $200 billion a year is not supported by standard U.S. trade deficit figures and should be treated as a political claim rather than a verified economic fact. The long-term fate of CUSMA itself, full renegotiation, a narrower set of amendments, or a slower unraveling stretched out over the agreement's remaining scheduled reviews before 2036, is still an open question that even Canada's own central bank describes as one of the largest uncertainties facing the country's economic outlook. And Trump's comments about the possibility of something happening with Greenland remain, as of this recording, exactly that. Comments, not policy, and worth watching rather than treating as settled fact. It's also worth zooming out to the sheer scale of what's actually being negotiated here, because the numbers involved are easy to lose inside the back and forth of individual deadlines. Canada remains one of the largest trading partners the United States has anywhere in the world, with hundreds of billions of dollars in goods crossing the border in both directions every single year, Energy, autos, lumber, agricultural products flowing south, manufactured goods and machinery flowing north, integrated supply chains built up over 3 decades under NAFTA, and then CUSMA that don't unwind cleanly just because a tariff rate changes. That interdependence is exactly why RBC's economists describe the potential loss of CUSMA protections as pushing the average effective American tariff rate on Canadian exports from roughly 3% up towards 6 or 7%, a real and painful increase for exposed industries, but one that, as RBC itself points out, still leaves Canada facing a comparatively lower tariff burden than most of the other major trading partners the United States has been squeezing over the same period. That comparison matters for understanding Carney's negotiating posture. He wasn't trying to escape tariffs altogether. Nobody trading with this White House in 2025 and 2026 has managed that. He was trying to keep Canada's position relatively better than its peers, even while absorbing real damage in specific sectors like steel, aluminum, and now dairy and consumer goods under the new Section 338 list. Sourcing on all of this comes from named checkable reporting. NBC News, CNN, CNBC, and CP24 on this week's tariff pause and Carney statement. NPR, The Hill, and Market Beat on the July and August 2025 tariff escalation to 35%. CBC News, Yahoo News, and the Associated Press on the Oval Office meetings and Trump's 51st state comments. CBC's coverage of Trump's interview with NBC's Kristen Welker, the Bank of Canada, Global Affairs Canada, RBC Economics, and the law firm Blake's on the CUSMA joint review and its outcome, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business on the practical tariff burden facing Canadian companies, and Policy Magazine's analysis of this week's LeBlanc-Greer announcement. Where a claim originates from a single government's framing rather than independently verified data, like the $200 billion subsidy figure, that distinction has been flagged rather than smoothed over. So where does this actually leave things heading into Friday? Ottawa has 3 more days to turn significant progress into a finished, written agreement under the shadow of a 50% tariff that could, in theory, still snap back into force if the documentation isn't completed in time. Washington has a president who has spent a year and a half trying to force a decisive public capitulation out of a much smaller economy right next door, and has instead ended up in exactly the kind of drawn-out, detail-by-detail negotiation that a former central banker like Carney was arguably always better built to survive than any of his predecessors. Neither side is declaring the fight over. But the terms of engagement have clearly shifted from where they stood 18 months ago, and that shift, more than any single tariff number, might be the most important development to come out of this entire saga. If you want to actually understand where U.S.-Canada relations go from here, not the headline version, but the actual mechanics of what's being negotiated behind closed doors, this channel is where that gets tracked as it happens, deal by deal, deadline by deadline, with the sourcing laid out the same way it has been today. Subscribing means you won't miss the moment Friday's deadline resolves one way or the other, and you won't miss what comes next in the CUSMA review either, because that story is nowhere close to finished. If deep, sourced breakdowns like this one are useful to you, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure the next one reaches you the moment it's ready, rather than days later after the story's already moved on. Here's the honest question worth sitting with. Carney never gave Trump the dramatic confrontation the last year and a half seemed to be building toward. No shouting match, no walkout, no viral moment of defiance. He gave him patience, paperwork, and a quiet pivot toward Europe instead. Is that actually the shrewder way to negotiate with an opponent who thrives on spectacle, or does refusing the fight on those terms simply delay a reckoning that both countries are eventually going to have out loud?